Every woman who had ever walked through the doors of Sung Manor left the same way. Quietly, carefully, with their smiles slightly too stiff, and their eyes pointed at the floor. Because somewhere between the entrance hall and the exit, they had all learned the same unspoken rule. Sung Jimin did not see them. Not the daughter of the Busan shipping family, whose father practically gift-wrapped her and delivered her to his front gate with a bottle of vintage whiskey and a prayer. Not the model who wore a red dress to a business dinner because someone told her red was his favorite color, it wasn't. And not the daughter of a Seoul city councilman who laughed too loudly at everything he said and touched his arm 3 times in one evening, hoping volume and nerve could do what beauty alone had failed to. Sung Jimin, 33 years old, owner of the Sung Hotel empire, and the quiet king of the most feared crime network in Seoul, had never once looked at a woman and felt anything. Not curiosity, not interest, not even the ghost of attraction. His enemies said it was because he had no heart left. His own lieutenants said it was because he had buried it himself, somewhere around the year his mother died and the year his father showed him that loyalty was just a word people used before they betrayed you. Either way, the result was the same. Women entered his orbit and felt the temperature drop. Some thought they could warm him. None of them could. The Sung name commanded silence in every room he entered. Men who ran their own empires straightened in their chairs when his car pulled into a driveway. His bodyguards moved through spaces like the walls understood them. His voice was low, controlled, and almost never raised, because Sung Jimin had learned a long time ago that the quietest men in a room are always the most dangerous. Sung Manor itself reflected everything he had become. Dark wood paneling that had absorbed decades of secrets. Leather chairs worn smooth from the weight of negotiations that never made it into any official record. Crystal decanters of whiskey that sat on polished mahogany tables like silent witnesses. And light, amber, low, golden, that made everything look expensive and everything feel like a warning. The staff knew exactly how to exist in that house. Silently, efficiently, invisibly. And if there was one thing, Madam, the head housekeeper, had drilled into every new hire from their first morning briefing, it was this. You do not react in front of Mr. Sung. You do not laugh. You do not flinch. You do not let your feelings travel across your face. Because in Sung Manor, being noticed by the wrong person for the wrong reason was a career-ending mistake, and being noticed by Jimin himself for any reason at all was something none of them knew how to survive. Lila Gilbert had heard the speech. She had nodded at all the right parts. She had kept her face composed during the tour of the estate. She had said, "Yes, ma'am," to Madame O's instructions at exactly the right moments. And she had gone back to the staff quarters that first evening and told herself very clearly that she was here for one reason only: the money. Her mother's hospital bills were not going to pay themselves. Her brother Micah's school fees were not going to disappear. And this job, live-in housekeeping at the most prestigious private estate in the Gangnam district, paid 3 times what any hotel position in the city would offer, which meant Lila Gilbert, 25 years old, with her hair pinned into a low, neat bun and her charcoal gray uniform ironed into sharp creases, was prepared to be exactly what this house required her to be: invisible, efficient, silent. She had not, however, prepared for the moment Sung Jimin made a joke. It was a Tuesday, past midnight, the kind of late that made the entire house feel different, heavier, quieter, like the building itself was holding its breath. Lila had been assigned to serve during a private strategy meeting in the East Wing sitting room. She had been doing exactly what she was trained to do, moving carefully between the sidebar and the long mahogany table, refilling crystal glasses with steady hands, and making herself invisible in the way only people who have practiced it understand. Around the table sat 6 men in dark suits, all of them stone-faced, all of them focused on Jimin at the head of the table. One of his lieutenants had just finished making a very unconvincing excuse for why a particular deal had gone sideways, and the silence that followed it was the kind that made experienced men sweat through expensive shirts. Sung Jimin looked at him for a long moment. Then, in a voice as flat and dry as a winter road, He said something so quietly brutal, so unexpectedly precise, and so darkly, impossibly funny that it cut through every layer of tension in the room like a blade through smoke. It was not a joke meant for laughter. It was the kind of thing dangerous men say when they want everyone in the room to understand exactly how serious they are. But Lila's body did not receive that memo in time. The laugh escaped her before she could catch it. Small, involuntary, barely half a second. But in Sung Manor's private meeting room, at midnight, during a strategy session where a man had just been quietly threatened in front of 6 witnesses, that half-second landed like a grenade. The crystal decanter slipped. Amber whiskey hit the mahogany and spread across the table in a slow, horrifying wave. The lieutenant Jimin had just threatened, forgot completely about his own problems. Every man at the table went rigid. Behind Jimin, Kang Hyun, his closest bodyguard, the one with the expression that never changed, let one hand drift instinctively toward the inside of his jacket. The second guard raised a single warning finger, as if the gesture could somehow reach backward through time and stop the sound that had already left Lila's mouth. Lila stood with one hand pressed over her lips, and the other still gripping the decanter, the whiskey still dripping off the table's edge, horror flooding through her so completely and so quickly that for a moment she forgot how to form words. She was already imagining the conversation with Madame O. She was already mentally calculating whether she could pack her bag and be out of the house before anyone knocked on her door. She was already thinking about Micah's school fees, her mother's next treatment, and the very short list of options she had outside this job. And then Sung Jimin turned his head, and he looked at her. Not through her. Not past her. At her. He was exactly what the house had made him look like. Early 30s, lean, dressed in a black suit that fit him like it had been sewn onto his body, a white shirt open at the collar, his dark hair brushed back from a face that was almost unreasonably sharp, strong jaw, heavy brows, dark eyes that had the particular quality of making everything they focused on feel both chosen and threatened. He was seated with one elbow on the armrest and his fist resting against his mouth, and when his eyes found Lila's, that fist shifted. His fingers slowly uncurled. The room waited for the verdict. Jimin looked at the whiskey spreading across his table. Then he looked back at Lila, and the corner of his mouth, that controlled, unreadable, never quite smiling mouth moved. Not into anger. Not into the cold dismissal that every person in that room expected and feared. Into something none of them had seen before. Something quiet and dangerous and entirely new. "You think I'm funny?" he said. His voice was low, unhurried, almost amused. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than before. Not the silence of fear, though fear was still absolutely present in every other person in the room. This was the silence of something shifting, something cracking open, something that, once broken, would never quite go back together the same way. Lila Gilbert had come to Sung Manor to stay invisible. She had lasted 6 days. And Sung Jimin, the man who had never once in his life noticed any woman the way a man notices a woman he cannot stop thinking about, felt something happen in his chest that he did not have a name for. Something cold moved. And for the first time in 13 years, he let it. Before we begin, go ahead and subscribe, like, and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing this storytelling family spread across the world. The Sung name had been feared in Seoul for 3 generations. Sung Jimin's grandfather had built the first piece of it with bare hands and borrowed money in the years after the war, when the city was still deciding what it wanted to become, and powerful men were still deciding who would get to shape it. His father had doubled it, then tripled it, and then made the kind of choices that turned a wealthy family into something else entirely, something that didn't appear in any government registry, but that every serious player in the city understood without needing it. Explained. By the time Sung Jimin inherited both the hotel empire and the underworld network at the age of 22, the name was already a full sentence. You didn't need to say anything after it. The Sung hotels were impeccable, 6 properties across Seoul and 2 internationally, each one designed to feel like power made physical, clean lines, heavy materials, Staff who had been trained to anticipate needs before they were spoken and to disappear the moment their presence was no longer required. Business journalists wrote about Jimin the way they wrote about monuments, with admiration calibrated carefully to avoid the appearance of fear, even though fear was almost always the thing underneath. The underworld piece of it was quieter. It didn't have press coverage or quarterly earnings reports. It had relationships, favors, and a reputation so thoroughly established that most of the men who operated in that space didn't test it anymore. They had heard too many stories from people who had tried. Jimin was not the kind of boss who ruled through chaos. He didn't need to. The discipline he maintained in every room he walked into was the kind that came from absolute certainty. The certainty that he understood every angle of every situation before anyone else in it had finished forming their first opinion. He was methodical, patient, and impossible to read, and those three qualities together were more frightening to most people than volume ever could have been. He was also, by any standard anyone wanted to apply, an extraordinarily handsome man. This was inconvenient for everyone around him, because it meant women consistently misread his silence as intrigue rather than indifference. And they arrived in his life believing their looks would accomplish something that his own mother's love had already failed to do. His mother. That was the part people who studied him from the outside never fully understood. She had died when he was 19, and the manner of her death, a betrayal by the same family that had claimed to be his father's closest allies, had done something to the architecture of Jimin's interior life that no amount of time had fully rebuilt. He had grieved exactly once, privately, and then he had sealed that room and focused on everything else: the empire, the network, the absolute assurance that no one would ever be close enough to him to be weaponized against him again. Women came and went. Society women, heiresses, actresses, a prosecutor's daughter who apparently thought her father's office would make her bulletproof. They arrived at his galas in gowns chosen with strategic precision. They laughed at things that were not funny. They touched their own hair when he glanced in their direction. They found ways to engineer proximity and then stood inside it, waiting for something to shift in his expression. Nothing ever did. He was not cruel to them. Cruelty would have required caring enough to want a reaction. He was simply absent, present in the room, polished, appropriately pleasant when occasion demanded it, and entirely, unreachably elsewhere, in every way that mattered. The women left. The next ones arrived. The cycle continued. And Sung Jimin moved through it all with the same steady, winter-edged calm that had defined him for over a decade, until the night a new maid poured whiskey on his table and laughed at the worst possible moment, and something in the carefully maintained silence of his interior life heard that sound and refused to let it go. Lila Gilbert had taken the job because the number in the offer email had 3 more digits than anything she had been expecting. She had spent 40 minutes staring at it on her phone in the break room of the hotel where she'd been working front desk, reading it a second time, then a third, then sending it to her best friend Jade back in Atlanta with a message that said simply, "This can't be real." It was real. The Sung estate required live-in domestic staff with a minimum of 3 years of service experience, verifiable references, Korean language proficiency at a conversational level, and what the listing described only as an understanding of discretion in a high-profile household environment. Lila had the experience. She had been working in hospitality since she was 20 to help her mother keep the apartment after her father died. She had the references. She had spent 2 years studying Korean at night after falling in love with the language through dramas and music, and she was better at it now than most of her interviewers expected, which she had learned to treat as an advantage rather than a surprise. The discretion part she had figured out instinctively. She had grown up in a household where you didn't put your business outside, where you learned to read a room before you opened your mouth, where survival was a skill set before it was ever a philosophy. She had been in Seoul for 8 months, on a working visa long enough to understand the city's rhythms, long enough to have a small circle of people she trusted, long enough to know that this particular job offer was attached to a name that made taxi drivers lower their voices when they passed certain buildings. But her mother's last hospital bill had been bigger than the previous one, and Micah's school needed fees paid by the end of the month. And Lila Gilbert was not a woman who had the luxury of making decisions based on atmosphere. She took the job. The first morning at Sung Manor, Madame O conducted the orientation with the energy of a woman who had survived things she would never discuss and intended to keep surviving them through sheer organizational discipline. She was in her late 50s, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in a dark house uniform that looked like it had been pressed with military precision, and she delivered every instruction with the specific weight of someone who was not saying it twice. The kitchen, the laundry schedule, the staff quarters, the approved areas of the estate versus the areas that required explicit permission or direct assignment, the behavior standards, voice level, eye contact protocols, the precise etiquette for serving during meetings, and then, last, stated not as a rule, but as a simple transfer of information. Mr. Sung does not engage with staff beyond what is necessary. You will not interpret his silence as a problem, and you will not attempt to fill it. You will do your work, do it well, and you will be invisible when your work is done. Lila nodded. You understand discretion? Madame O asked, studying her. I understand it, Lila said. Something flickered in the older woman's expression. Not warmth, exactly, but a faint recalibration as if she had expected something less direct and was mildly uncertain how to categorize what she'd received instead. She showed Lila to her room without another word. The room was plain and small, and the cleanest space Lila had occupied in 2 years. She put her bag down, looked out the narrow window at the immaculate rear garden, and reminded herself for the 4th time that day what she was here for. The money, her mother, Micah, that was all. She was here for 6 months, maximum. She would be professional. She would be invisible. She would not let the atmosphere of this place, the old money and the armed guards, and the low-light rooms that smelled like cedar and something older and more serious, she would not let any of it distract her from the specific, practical reason she had come. She lasted 6 days before she accidentally destroyed that entire plan with a laugh she couldn't stop. The first 5 days had actually gone well. She had learned the rhythms of the house quickly, which corridors were in regular use, which staff members were worth watching as a guide to unspoken rules, which rooms required extra care and which could be handled efficiently. The estate was large but logical, and Lila had always been good at reading environments. She did her work cleanly and without drama. She was, by every measure, invisible. On day 6, she was assigned to the East Wing sitting room for a late service during a private meeting. Madame O had given the briefing with her usual economy of words. Fill the decanter when it fell below halfway. Clear glasses discreetly when they were finished. Do not speak unless spoken to, and under no circumstances react to anything said in the room. This last instruction had been stated 3 separate times in 3 slightly different ways, which told Lila more than the instruction itself. She dressed carefully that evening. Uniform pressed, hair tight in its low bun, pearl stud earrings small enough to be invisible, present enough to remind herself that she was still a person underneath the gray and white. She went in at 10:50 and positioned herself at the sidebar the way she had been shown. Still, quiet, available, functionally non-existent. The men at the table were the kind of men who existed in expensive suits and created weather systems when they were unhappy. She recognized the energy without knowing the names. She had worked in hospitality long enough to understand the specific body language of men who were accustomed to deference the way they took up space without announcing it, the way they waited to see how a room would arrange itself around them before they said anything that mattered. Sung Jimin was at the head of the table. She had seen him once before, briefly, on her second day, across the length of the main corridor. He had been walking toward the east entrance with 2 men flanking him and a phone to his ear, and she had been walking in the opposite direction carrying fresh linens, and their paths had not technically crossed. She had registered him the way you registered anything that changed the temperature of an environment quickly, instinctively, and with a specific mental note that said, stay out of the way of that. Up close, in the amber light of the sitting room, he was different. He was sharper, somehow. Everything about him was controlled in a way that made the word controlled feel inadequate, like calling the ocean wet. He sat at the head of the table in a black suit and white shirt with the top button open, one arm on the armrest, his attention on the man speaking across from him with the focused, unhurried quality of someone who had already made his decision and was simply allowing the formality of explanation to complete itself. The man speaking was making an excuse. This was clear from the structure of his sentences and from the specific way the other 5 men at the table had all found neutral points on the wall to look at, the way people do when they don't want to be associated with a situation that is about to end badly. Lila refilled the decanter. She cleared a glass. She moved back to the sidebar. And then Sung Jimin spoke. It was one sentence. It was flat, dry, and almost offhand, the kind of observation that landed differently in a room like this one because the man saying it had the actual power to follow through on everything underneath it. It was the verbal equivalent of someone setting down a weapon and saying, "I won't need this." It was also, objectively, if you stripped away every layer of menace and corporate violence and criminal implication, darkly, precisely, unexpectedly funny, Lila's brain understood that it was dangerous. Lila's body disagreed. The laugh came out before she could decide not to let it. Half a second. A single, involuntary exhale of genuine amusement that she converted into a cough approximately 1 beat too late. The decanter slipped. She caught it, but not before a solid pour of whiskey had hit the crystal tumbler sideways and splashed across the polished table in an amber wave that spread toward the nearest stack of documents and kept moving. The room went perfectly, completely silent. Lila's hand froze over the spill. Her other hand was over her mouth. She was aware, with every nerve in her body, of the bodyguard whose hand had drifted toward his jacket, of the second guard's raised finger that said, "Stop, don't make this worse," of the 6 men at the table who had all turned to look at her with the collective expression of people watching someone step off a curb into traffic. And then Sung Jimin turned. Not quickly. Slowly. Deliberately. The way he seemed to do everything as though the world would wait for him. And it always did. He looked at the whiskey. He looked at her hand still pressed over her mouth. He looked at her face, the wide eyes, the shock, the genuine horror of someone who has just done the exact thing they were hired not to do. His fist, resting against the armrest, uncurled slowly. "You think I'm funny," he said. The room stayed silent. But the silence had changed. It was no longer holding its breath waiting for an explosion. It was holding its breath waiting for something it had no category for. Lila lowered her hand from her mouth. She picked up the linen from the sidebar and pressed it to the spill with steady hands, because her hands at least knew what to do even if no other part of her did. "I apologize, Mr. Sung," she said. Her voice was level. "It won't happen again." He watched her clean the table. He didn't look away. And when she finished and stepped back to her position at the sidebar, she felt his gaze follow her there and stay, just for a moment, before he turned back to the man across from him, as if the last 90 seconds had not occurred. The meeting continued. Lila stood at the sidebar with her back straight and her face neutral and her heart going at approximately twice its normal speed, and she spent the rest of the evening being exactly as invisible as she had promised herself she would be. But something had already changed. She didn't know it yet. She would figure it out later, in her small, clean room with the window that faced the garden, lying awake in the particular way you lie awake when something has happened that you don't yet have language for. Sung Jimin had looked at her. Not through her. Not past her. At her. And in this house, from what she had already learned, that was not nothing. The first indication that something had shifted came 2 days later. Lila was restocking the pantry when she became aware that Kang Hyun Jimin's closest bodyguard, the broad-shouldered, perpetually composed man who moved through the estate like a fixed point that the rest of the house rotated around, had appeared in the kitchen doorway and was talking to Madame O in a voice too low for Lila to hear from where she was. She didn't try to hear it. She kept her hands busy and her face forward and finished the task she'd been given. But that afternoon, Madame O found her in the laundry room and told her she was being reassigned. The East Wing service rotation. 3 evenings a week. The whiskey situation, Lila said carefully. Has not been mentioned, Madame O said, and left. Lila turned back to the laundry and thought about that for a long moment. The reassignment made no practical sense. The East Wing was senior staff territory, the kind of assignment given to people who had been with the household for years, not to someone 6 days in. She filed that information where she filed everything. In the part of her mind that was always observing, always building a map of whatever environment she was in, always tracking the logic of how things worked so she wouldn't be caught off guard again. The map she was building said, "You have been noticed." The map also said, "Be careful." She was careful. She arrived for every East Wing assignment exactly on time, prepared, with her work done cleanly and her presence managed to near invisibility. She did not make eye contact with Sung Jimin unless he directed a question at her, which for the first week he did not. She did not change anything about how she carried herself except to apply the same discipline she always had with slightly more deliberate attention. But she noticed things. She noticed that when she was in a room, his attention moved differently than it did when she was not. Not dramatically. Not in a way that anyone watching casually would have catalogued as significant. Just a slight, controlled shift, the kind of thing you only caught if you were already paying close attention yourself. And Lila had been paying close attention to rooms her entire life. She noticed that the staff responded to her differently since the reassignment. Not hostilely. More carefully, the particular carefulness of people recalibrating how much weight a person carries, because weight in this house came from one source, and one source only. She noticed that Jimin's coldness was not uniform. This was the thing that surprised her most, because every account she'd been given of him from other staff had described him as uniformly, reliably cold. Madame O. He does not engage. The kitchen manager. Don't expect anything from him. One of the junior housekeepers, in a whispered confidence that Lila suspected she would deny if asked. He's not cruel. He's just not there. Like a building that looks like someone lives in it, but the lights are always off. The lights were not always off. She watched him correct a junior member of his business staff during a brief encounter in the corridor near the study. The correction was precise, direct, and made the recipient visibly smaller, but it contained zero contempt. It was the tone of someone who expected competence and was simply noting its absence, with no particular pleasure in the noting. She watched him speak to Kang Hyun one morning near the side entrance brief, low-voiced, but not in the register of a boss giving orders. Something quieter than that. Something that looked, from the distance at which Lila was observing it, like the only actual conversation in the house. And she watched him, once, in the corridor near the library, stop for approximately 4 seconds in front of a framed photograph she had not yet noticed an older one, a woman who didn't look like the estate's usual aesthetic, softer somehow, out of place among the clean, modern lines, and then continue walking without expression. But his hand, for those 4 seconds, had been at his side with the fingers slightly open. Lila filed that too. She was not developing feelings. She was building a map. That was what she told herself, and she believed it, mostly, in the same way you believe things you need to believe in order to keep functioning. The truth was that Sung Jimin was more complicated than his reputation, and she was finding complicated things consistently more interesting than simple ones, which had always been her specific problem. The library was off the main residential corridor on the 2nd floor, and it was, technically, outside the areas where Lila had been granted routine access. She had been cleaning the guest bathroom 2 doors down from it when she'd heard what she'd assumed was a member of senior staff, and when she'd gone to check whether the room needed service before she finished the floor, she'd found it empty, the cleaning clearly current, and a wall of books that reached ceiling height and curved around a reading alcove with a leather chair and a side lamp already on. She should have left. She told herself she would leave in 5 minutes. She had been working 14-hour days. She was behind on the novel she'd been carrying in her bag for 3 weeks, and the specific book she could see from where she stood, a worn Korean translation of James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room, made something in her chest do a slow, traitorous shift toward wanting. She sat in the alcove. She opened the book. She told herself, 10 minutes. She lost track of time. The first sign that she wasn't alone was the light change, the door opening, the corridor light briefly widening across the floor, and then the soft sound of the door closing again. She looked up. Sung Jimin stood in the center of his own library with his suit jacket removed and his sleeves pushed to the elbows, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not, for once, perfectly neutral. It was something between surprise and something she did not have an immediate name for. "This room requires access clearance," he said. "I know." She closed the book carefully, with one finger keeping the page. "I'm sorry. I'll go." She stood. "What are you reading?" She turned back. He was looking at the book in her hand with a focus that didn't match the temperature of the question. "Baldwin," she said. "The Korean translation is better than I expected. The rhythm survives." Something shifted in his expression. Barely. But she caught it. "You read Korean literature?" "When I can find it. My Korean is better than most people expect, so I try to use it for things that aren't just practical." She paused. "That's probably not relevant. I'll leave the book here." "Sit down," he said. She looked at him. "That wasn't ambiguous," he said. "Not unkindly, just accurately." She sat down. He moved to the chair on the opposite side of the alcove, not the close chair, the one that created the configuration of a room being shared rather than occupied together, and he picked up the book he'd apparently come here to retrieve. She recognized the cover, a dense economics text that she had shelved herself 2 weeks earlier. For approximately 90 seconds, neither of them said anything. "Your Korean is good," he said, without looking up from the opening page of his book. "Thank you." "How long?" 2 years seriously. 2 more before that casually. Another silence. "Why?" he asked. "I liked the structure of it. And I liked Korea. I wanted to be able to move through it properly, not just functionally." He looked up from the book. "Most foreigners aim for functional. I noticed. I've always found that a little sad." She said it before she thought about whether to say it, and then she waited for the temperature in the room to drop. It didn't. Instead, the corner of his mouth shifted the same fractional movement she had seen in the meeting room, the one that wasn't quite a smile but was as close to one as his face seemed to allow. "Sad," he repeated, as if he were testing the word. Not in a judgmental way, just, there's a whole interior life to a language. The things it prioritizes and the things it doesn't have words for. Staying on the surface of it means you only ever see the city from the window of a car. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What does Baldwin have that the English version doesn't?" The translator understood what he was actually talking about, she said. So they weren't translating words. They were translating the feeling underneath the words. That's rarer than it sounds. He looked at her the way she had come to recognize as his version of sustained interest. Steady, undemonstrative, impossible to fully read. "You have an opinion about everything," he said. "Not everything, just the things I've actually thought about." "And the things you haven't thought about?" "I try to keep quiet about those." He made a sound, not a laugh, exactly, but adjacent to one. Something that had started as a laugh and been converted at the last moment into a more acceptable form. She had a sudden, vivid understanding that Sung Ji-min probably didn't laugh very often, and that the sounds that almost became laughs were likely the closest most people ever got. "You're not afraid of me," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It landed more like an observation someone makes about a weather anomaly, noting that the pattern has broken without yet understanding why. "I'm appropriately cautious," she said. "That's different. Most people can't make that distinction. Most people let fear and caution collapse into the same thing because it's easier." She looked at him steadily. "That usually makes the fear bigger and the caution worse." He looked at her for a long moment. The economics book was no longer doing anything in his hand. He wasn't reading it, and they both knew it. "Nobody has spoken to me like this in a long time," he said. "Like I'm a person in a room rather than a problem to be managed." The honesty of it was quiet and sudden in the way that honest things often are not announced, not performed, just present, like a window that had been left open. Lila felt something in her chest pull toward that honesty, the way she always felt pulled toward things that were real underneath the surface. She told that pull to stay where it was. "You're the most powerful person in this house," she said carefully. "I think sometimes that makes it hard for people to see past the power to the person." "And you can?" "I can see that you came to the library at midnight to read an economics textbook," she said. "That tells me something about you that your reputation doesn't." "What does it tell you?" "That you're still curious. People who are only interested in power stop being curious. They already think they know everything that matters." She paused. "You don't act like someone who thinks they know everything." He looked at the table between them for a moment, then back at her. "You should probably go to your room," he said, "before Madame O does her 11 o'clock check and finds you missing from the staff corridor." She stood and set the Baldwin book carefully on the table beside his chair. "I'll bring it back tomorrow." "Keep it," he said. "The shelf has 2 copies." She picked it up and walked to the door. She had her hand on the handle when he spoke again. "Lila." She turned. He hadn't moved. He was sitting with the economics book open in his lap now, but his eyes were on her. "Your Korean doesn't need improvement," he said. "For what it's worth." She held the compliment for a second, the way you hold something that costs more than you expected. "Thank you, Mr. Sung," she said, and she left. In the corridor, walking back to the staff wing, she passed Kang-hyun standing near the stairwell. He looked at her, then at the book in her hand, then back at her, with an expression she would later come to read as, "I see you, I know exactly what is happening here, and you should be very careful." She went to her room. She lay awake for a long time, not thinking about Sung Jimin or telling herself she wasn't, which was not quite the same thing. By the 3rd week, the house knew. Not everything. Not the library. Not the specific quality of the conversation that had happened in it, or the way Jimin had said her name when she was already at the door. The house knew only what the house could observe. That Sung Jimin had, on 4 separate occasions, walked through or paused in a space that Lila was currently occupying. That Kang-hyun had, quietly and without explanation, started appearing in her general vicinity more often than her job description warranted. That Director Bae, the estate manager, had twice asked Madame O for Lila's schedule in a way that Madame O had mentioned, flatly and without further comment, to Lila herself. The staff talked because staff always talked. Because in a house where silence was the operating mode, any deviation from silence was interesting. One of the junior housekeepers, a 20-year-old named Somi who was constitutionally incapable of not sharing information, had told Lila at breakfast that 2 of the kitchen staff were having a debate about whether the boss's interest was actual or just observation. Another girl had apparently suggested that foreign staff were always observed more closely during their first month for security reasons, which Somi had dismissed with the confidence of someone who had worked at the estate for 2 years and felt certain she understood it better than any security protocol. "He doesn't look at people," Somi said, with the weight of hard-won knowledge. "He looks at you. There's a difference." "Somi," Lila said, without looking up from her tea. "I'm just telling you what everyone else is saying. Everyone else should focus on their work. Everyone else is focused on their work. This is what it looks like when we're focused." Somi refilled her own tea with the cheerful efficiency of someone who genuinely enjoyed mornings. "Madame O is going to talk to you today, by the way. I heard her telling Director Bae she was going to have a professional conversation with the new international staff member." Lila set down her cup. "What kind of professional conversation?" she asked. Somi gave her a look that said, "The kind that uses professional as a way to mean something else." Madame O found her after lunch, in the corridor near the East Wing linen closet. She did not use the word professional. She did not use any words with obvious edge to them. She spoke, as she did everything, with the specific precision of someone who was communicating more than the literal content of her sentences. "This household functions on clarity," Madame O said. "Everyone in it has a defined role. Roles are how the house stays safe." She paused, with the weight of the pause doing most of the actual work. "Safety in this house means knowing what you are and what you are not. I understand, Lila said. I believe you understand, Madame O said. I want to be certain you also apply. She walked away. Lila stood in the corridor for a moment and absorbed the specific texture of what had just happened. It was not hostile. It was not a threat. It was, she thought, possibly the most efficient delivery of, "Be careful. This is not a game that she had ever received in her life." She thought about applying it. She thought about the library, and the Baldwin book, and the way he'd said keep it, and the way the sentence had felt like something larger than its words. She thought about her mother's hospital bills, Micah's school fees, the number in the offer email. She thought about all of that. And then Kang Hyun appeared at the far end of the corridor and nodded once in her direction, not a greeting exactly, more an acknowledgement, the kind that said, "I see you. You are currently accounted for. Carry on." And Lila had the specific, deeply inconvenient realization that she was not as invisible in this house as she had originally planned to be. And then, on a Thursday afternoon, Seo Yura arrived. The car was a black Mercedes with private plates that Kang Hyun clocked from the security monitor before it had even reached the gate. He said something low to the man beside him and made a call that lasted 30 seconds and involved no words that Lila, collecting fresh linens from the supply room nearby, was able to actually hear. But the energy in the house changed in the particular way. It only changed for external arrivals. And by the time the front door opened, Lila had been redirected from the east corridor to the garden supply task with a smooth efficiency that suggested the redirection was deliberate. She worked in the garden for 40 minutes, with half her attention on the hedges and the other half on the specific texture of the sounds coming from inside the house, the particular click of heels that were expensive and unhurried, the kind worn by someone who moved as though spaces were required to accommodate her rather than the other way around. She didn't see So Yura that afternoon. But Somi, at dinner, described her in the specific, breathless register of someone who had caught a glimpse of something and needed to distribute it. Tall, black hair, red coat, the kind of face that looked like it had been assembled from a set of preferences. She had gone directly to the main sitting room and stayed for 40 minutes, and then she had left, and Jimin had gone to his office and not appeared again. "Who is she?" Lila asked, keeping her voice neutral. "Seo Yura," Somi said. "Her family and the Sung family go back years. Everyone says they have an understanding." "What kind of understanding?" Somi gave her a look that landed in the same category as Madame O's corridor conversation, just wrapped in a younger person's bluntness. The kind where two powerful families decide things about each other's futures without necessarily asking the people involved. Lila ate her dinner. She thought about the library, the economics book, the Baldwin. Keep it. She thought about Madame O's corridor, knowing what you are and what you are not. She looked at the book, sitting on the edge of her small desk, when she went to bed that night, a worn Korean translation, borrowed from a library she wasn't cleared to access, given to her by a man who ruled two worlds, and had, for the duration of one midnight conversation, seemed genuinely and entirely present in a way that she suspected he was not always. She opened it to where she'd left off. She told herself she was just reading, but outside her window, the garden lay dark, and the manor stood solid, and the silence of the house settled around everything like something that had been holding its breath for a very long time, waiting for the next thing to happen. Lila turned the page. It started the way dangerous things often start. Slowly, and then all at once. The first time was the kitchen. Lila had a habit she'd carried since childhood of waking before the house did. 4:30, sometimes 5. The particular silence of a building before it became itself for the day, before footsteps and schedules and the machinery of purpose started up. She used those hours to make tea, think without interruption, and remind herself of the specific shape of her own life before the day required her to pour it into someone else's house. She had not expected to find Sung Jimin at the kitchen island at 4:52 on a Wednesday morning, in a dark sweater and trousers without a jacket, reading something on his phone with the particular focused stillness of a man who slept badly and had decided not to pretend otherwise. She stopped in the doorway. He looked up. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he moved the documents he'd spread on the counter slightly to one side, creating a space, and looked back at his phone. Not an invitation, exactly. More an absence of obstruction. She made her tea. She stood at the far end of the island and drank it in the particular quiet of two people choosing not to fill a silence because the silence wasn't empty. He put his phone down after a while. "You're always up before the house," he said. "So are you." "I don't sleep well." "Neither do I, lately." She wrapped both hands around her mug. New environments take time to settle into. He looked at her with something that was close to recognition not of her, specifically, but of the things she'd described. How long does it usually take? Depends on the environment. Some places never quite feel safe enough to sleep in. She said it simply, without self-pity. This one is getting there. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what makes a place safe enough to sleep in? Knowing the sounds. Understanding what belongs to the house and what doesn't. She paused. And knowing that the people in it are roughly who they appear to be. He absorbed that. She could see him turning it over the particular quality of his attention when something landed as more interesting than he'd expected. "And the people in this house?" he said. "Some of them," she said carefully. "I'm still working out the others." He almost smiled. She was becoming familiar with the geography of almost the specific distance between where his expression traveled and where it stopped, the invisible line that humor and warmth bumped against and rarely crossed. After that, the kitchen became a place they both arrived at in the early morning, without discussing it, and neither of them mentioned it to anyone else. And the staff who rose later found 2 clean mugs in the drying rack and drew no conclusions that they were willing to state aloud. The balcony happened 3 weeks after that. A rainstorm had moved through Seoul in the late evening and left behind the specific clean cold that comes after rain in autumn, and Lila had gone out to the small staff balcony off the east corridor to stand in it for a few minutes before bed, the way she sometimes went outside simply to remember that the world extended past the estate's walls. Jimin was on the larger adjacent balcony, separated by a stone partition, standing with his hands on the railing and looking at the wet city below with the expression she had come to recognize as the one he wore when he was not, performing anything for anyone. He heard her step onto the balcony. He didn't turn. "Rain," he said. "Rain," she agreed. They stood on their respective sides of the partition for a while. The city was gold and wet and quiet. "My mother liked the rain," he said eventually. Not to her, exactly more into the air between them. The way people speak when they have been holding something for long enough that it wants to be said even without an audience. She used to open all the windows when it rained, even in winter. The staff thought she was strange. Lila said nothing. She understood that the correct response to this kind of speaking was presence, not commentary. She was not suited to the life she was born into, he continued. She was too soft for it, too open. People mistook that for weakness. He paused. The people who ran things at the time made certain decisions about her that she had no power to stop. Another pause, and then flatly. She died because of those decisions. Indirectly. But the line is clear. "How old were you?" 19. He finally turned to look at her across the partition. The rain had left a film of moisture on everything, and in the amber light from the corridor windows behind them, he looked stripped of several layers, the suit, the reputation, the controlled surface. Just a man at a railing, saying something true, old enough to understand what had happened, young enough that it rewired everything. "I was 22 when my father died," she said. She offered it without drama, even trade. Heart attack, officially. But he'd been under a level of stress for years that I didn't fully understand until after. He worked as an accountant for a private firm. He found things in the books he wasn't supposed to find, and then he spent 18 months trying to figure out what to do about it. And then his heart gave out. She looked at the city. I've always thought those two things were connected, even if no one would ever put that on a certificate. Jimin was looking at her with a stillness she was beginning to understand as a form of intensity, the way he paid attention when something mattered. "What firm?" he said. "I don't know all of it. He kept records. I have a ledger. He left numbers, names, transaction codes. I've been trying to understand it for 3 years. She looked at him. I brought it with me, actually. To Seoul. I thought being here might help me find context. Something moved behind his eyes quick, barely visible, like a current under still water. Keep it safe, he said. She looked at him. Do you know something? A pause, long enough to be something. Keep it safe, he said again, and turned back to the city, and the conversation moved to other things, but Lila filed the pause the way she filed everything carefully, in the place where she kept information that hadn't yet told her what it meant. The study came after that. Late nights. The shared territory of two people who were both awake when they shouldn't be, both working past reasonable hours, both finding reasons to be in the same building after the rest of the house had released into sleep. He told her about his father, the empire inherited, the choices that had already been made before Jimin was old enough to make his own, the specific weight of stepping into a life that had been constructed around violence and calling it business. She told him about Micah, 12 years old, too smart for the school he was in, desperate for the school he could be in if the fees were paid consistently. She told him about her mother's illness and the specific arithmetic of caregiving from a distance. The wire transfers, the calls timed to avoid sleep interruptions, the guilt that sat at the bottom of every day like sediment. He listened to all of it the way he listened to things that mattered, completely, without interruption, without the particular distance that most powerful people maintained between themselves and the real details of other people's lives. You came here for them, he said one night. Not for yourself. I'm here for myself too, she said. I want things. I have plans. The money makes those possible. What plans? Finish my business degree. Open something of my own eventually. Something that doesn't depend on being in someone else's house. You have a degree? 2 years toward one. I had to stop. She said it without resentment, just fact, the way she handled most things that had been hard. I'll finish it. You will, he said. Not a question. Not encouragement, exactly. Certainty. She looked at him across the study, at the man who owned half of Seoul and had apparently decided to have absolute faith in her plans, and felt the pull in her chest do something it had been doing with increasing frequency, which was refuse to be filed and managed and kept in its correct category. She filed it anyway. She was running out of room, but she filed it. The morning Lila found her room searched. She knew before she opened the door. The specific displacement of things, the angle of her bag, the position of the small stack of books on her desk was slight enough that someone moving quickly and trying to be undetected would have thought they'd managed it. But Lila had grown up in shared housing where you learned to track your own things with precision because the alternative was losing them, and she noticed the 2-centimeter shift in the ledger's position among her belongings the moment she crossed the threshold. She stood in the center of her room for a long moment. Then she checked everything. Methodically, carefully, the way she did everything. The ledger was still there, which meant either they hadn't found what they were looking for or they hadn't been looking for the ledger specifically. Her documents were in order. Nothing was missing. Someone had been looking for something. She sat on the edge of her bed and thought about who in this house would search her room and what they thought was in it and who was directing them to look. She thought about So Yura's black Mercedes, the 40-minute visit, Somi's voice, an understanding. She was still thinking about it when Kang Hyun knocked on her door at 7:15, which was not a time when Kang Hyun had ever knocked on her door. There's been an allegation made, he said. His face was the kind of professionally neutral that was being very precisely maintained. You're asked to come to the main sitting room. She came. The main sitting room contained Madam O, Director Bay, 2 of the junior housekeeping staff, and a woman from the estate's administrative team who was holding a small tablet with the particular grip of someone who has been given a task they are uncomfortable with. The allegation was jewelry. A specific necklace, a family piece, missing from the locked drawer in the guest suite that Lila had cleaned 2 weeks prior as part of a rotation. Lila stood in the center of the room and listened to it, and kept her face completely level. I didn't take anything, she said. Once, clearly, without elaboration. We understand this is uncomfortable, the administrative woman said, in the tone of someone who did not understand it at all and was simply using the word to smooth the surface of a difficult conversation. Search my room, Lila said. Now, with me present. Director Bay looked at Madame O. Madame O looked at Lila with an expression that had shifted from its usual professional distance into something that was harder to read, something watchful and calculating in a different register than before. That won't be necessary, said a voice from the doorway. The room turned. Sung Jimin stood in the frame of the door with his jacket on and his phone in his hand, and the particular quality of his stillness was the kind that preceded the specific rearrangement of a situation. The necklace is in the main safe, he said. It was moved there 6 days ago. I authorized the transfer. He looked at the administrative woman with a flatness that made her visibly recalibrate her posture. The record will show that. Check it, and then apologize to my staff. The silence that followed was the kind that rooms never fully recover from. His eyes moved to Lila for a fraction of a second, not long, not obvious, but deliberate in the way his eyes were always deliberate. Then back to Director Bay. My staff, he said again, quietly, the repetition of the phrase landing like a second anchor. The apology came. Stiff, brief, insufficient, and completely beside the point. Lila accepted it with a nod, and left the room with her back straight and her face calm, and her mind running at the speed it ran when it was building maps as fast as it could. Someone had made the allegation knowing it was false. Someone had searched her room. Both of those things pointed in the same direction. Outside the house, orchestrated by someone who wanted her removed or frightened, with the help of someone inside who could move through the estate's systems without triggering Jimin's own people. She went to the east corridor and stood by the window and waited. Kang Hyun appeared beside her within 2 minutes. My room was searched, she said, without turning. I know, he said. Is he aware? He's aware of more than he's said to you. A pause. He's going to want to talk to you tonight. She brought the ledger. She'd been carrying it everywhere since she found her room disturbed, tucked inside the inner pocket of the bag she never left in her room. And when she came to the study that night, she set it on the table between them, without preamble, and without waiting to see if the moment was right. My father's records, she said. Everything he documented before he died. Jimin picked it up carefully. He opened it to the first page, then the second, then moved through it with the specific, accelerating focus of someone who understood what they were looking at. He was silent for a long time. These transaction codes, he said finally. Where did he get access to these accounts? He worked for a private financial firm for 8 years. I don't know the firm's full structure. The letterhead was in Korean. I've been trying to trace it. You don't need to trace it. He set the ledger down. His voice had gone to the particular flatness that she now recognized as the sound of him processing something significant. I recognize 3 of these account identifiers. They belong to the CO family's secondary financial network. He looked at her. Your father found evidence of illegal capital movement through those accounts. The kind of evidence that would have been worth a great deal to specific people. And worth nothing to him, she said. He didn't know what to do with it. No. He knew exactly what he had. He just didn't have anyone to take it to safely. He paused. There are also 2 account codes here I don't recognize, which means part of this network is something I haven't seen before. She looked at him across the table. Someone in this house searched my room, she said. Someone knew I had this. Yes. Which means someone here is connected to the Seo family. Yes. And that person told So Yura about me. About you and me, she said it plainly, because they were past the stage where plainness about this particular thing required courage. That's why the jewelry allegation happened. Not to catch me, to destabilize me, to give her a reason to have me removed. Yes, he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, not quite the usual controlled focus, but something rawer underneath it, closer to the surface. Lila, I'm not leaving, she said. I know, he said it immediately. Not a concession, a certainty. I don't want you to leave. A pause. And then something that cost him visibly. I need you to understand what it means that I'm saying that. She looked at him across the width of the table, at the man who had built walls around himself since 19, who ran two worlds with the specific discipline of someone who had decided that distance was survival, who had said nobody has spoken to me like a person in a long time, with the quiet devastation of someone discovering a window in a sealed room. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. He looked at their hands. His fingers shifted slowly, and then turned, and then closed around hers with the careful, deliberate pressure of someone handling something they didn't want to break. "I know what it means," she said. He held her hand like it was the most serious thing he'd done in years. And for him, she suspected, it was. He ran the trap over the following week with the cold precision of someone who had been taught this particular method by a man he'd loved and later lost. He gathered his inner circle, Kang Hyun, Madam Oh, Director Bae, and two senior network lieutenants, and he fed each of them a different false piece of information. Different, discreet, traceable, to Kang Hyun. That he was moving Lila to a secured apartment in Mapo. To Madam Oh, that he was transferring a significant sum to a holding account in Japan. To Director Bae, that he was planning to meet with the head of a rival hotel group at the Lotte on Friday evening. To the first lieutenant, that he was canceling a specific shipment arrangement on the south route. To the second, that he was expanding operations into a new district in the east. He told Lila about the trap at 4:50 in the morning, over tea, in the kitchen that had become their hour. She listened without interrupting. "How will you know which piece was moved?" she asked. "The Seo family will act on it," he said. "They always do. Yura's father does not sit on information, he uses it immediately. Because using it is how he demonstrates that he has it." He looked at his cup. "One of those 5 pieces will trigger a move within 3 days. The move will tell me who gave it to them." She looked at him. "What will you do when you know?" He was quiet for a moment. "Handle it. Jimin." He looked up. She had started using his name without the honorific 2 weeks ago, and each time she did, it still arrived in him like something that needed to be adjusted to, something that the room around him had to accommodate. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Stay in the house. Don't go anywhere alone. Don't let Director Bae's people direct you anywhere." He paused. "And trust me." "I trust you," she said. Simply. The way she said true things. 3 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, men from the Seo network arrived at the Lotte Hotel and secured a private dining room for a meeting that would never take place because Sung Jimin had not scheduled any meeting there and never intended to. He received the report from his surveillance contact at 3:14 p.m. At 3:15, he texted Kang Hyun, "It's Bae." The reply came in 10 seconds. "I'll bring him in." Lila was in the east corridor when it happened. She heard the specific quality of the sound, not raised voices, not violence, just the controlled, inevitable sound of something that had been suspected becoming confirmed, and she waited in the corridor until Kang Hyun passed her and nodded once. Jimin came to the study at 10 that night. He looked like someone who had absorbed a significant impact and was refusing to show the extent of the damage. She said nothing when he sat down. She set tea on the table between them. She sat across from him and let the silence be what it needed to be. "He was with me for 12 years, Jimin said eventually. "After my mother died, he kept the estate running. He used to bring me food when I worked through the night." He looked at the table. "He was the closest thing to a consistent presence in my life for a decade." Did he say why? They had his son. A debt that had been building for years. He thought if he gave them small things, they would leave the boy alone. He was quiet. I would have helped him. If he had come to me, I would have cleared the debt, secured the boy, handled it. He didn't come to me. "Because he was afraid of you," she said. "Because everyone is afraid of me." "Not everyone," she said. He looked at her. The thing she had seen on his face more often now, not almost a smile, but something adjacent to tenderness, something that had been sealed behind the same wall as everything else and was finding its way through the cracks with increasing frequency. "His son is protected," he said. "I've arranged it. The debt is cleared. And Bae? Gone from the estate. Not harmed." He looked at the table. "I'm not my reputation." "I know." she said. I've always known. He looked at her for a long moment. You're the only person in my life who has ever been able to say that and be right. The banquet invitation had come before any of this, before the allegation, before the ledger, before the trap and the traitor. It had arrived on embossed cardstock with the Seo family seal, requesting Sung Jimin's attendance at a private alliance dinner at the Grand Hyatt on a Saturday in October, with the specific language of these invitations. The kind where the courtesy wrapping is thin enough to see the demand inside. Jimin had accepted. He had been going to accept regardless, because attending was intelligence and refusing was declaration. And he was not yet ready to declare. He was ready now. He went to the banquet in a black suit with the particular composure of a man who had already decided how the evening would end and was simply arriving for the performance of it. The room was everything these rooms always were. Expensive, beautiful, constructed around the display of power in its most socially legible form. The Seo family was positioned at the head of the arrangement with the confidence of people who believed the evening was going according to their script. Yura sat at the main table in a silver gown, composed and watchful and sharp in the way that only people who have been waiting for something they are certain they will get can be. She looked at Jimin across the room as he arrived and allowed herself a small, controlled smile. The smile of someone who had spent months arranging a situation and could see the arrangement holding. Jimin found his seat. He accepted a drink. He moved through the initial conversation with the polished, unhurried ease of a man who was not nervous and had no reason to be. At 9:15, the doors at the side of the room opened, and two men in dark suits walked in flanking Lila. She was not supposed to be here. That was immediately clear from the silence that rippled through the section of the room that understood the significance from the specific way Yura's composure shifted, just a fraction, from anticipated victory into something recalculating. Lila was dressed simply. She was carrying herself the way she carried herself everywhere, straight, composed, with the particular quality of presence that came from being entirely clear about who you were and entirely unintimidated by the room's assessment of it. The Seo family's head of security stood and made a declaration, audible to the relevant section of the room, that a member of the Sung household staff had been found in possession of documents stolen from the Seo family's private financial records. The accusation landed in the room like a flat stone dropped into still water. Jimin set down his glass. He stood slowly, with the specific patience of a man who had already been waiting for exactly this. Mr. Seo, he said, in the carrying, quiet voice that made rooms understand they needed to listen. The documents in question were not taken from your family. They were compiled by a man who worked for your family's subsidiary firm for 8 years before the stress of what he found in your records contributed to his death. He reached into his jacket and removed a folded document. I have the originals. The room was very quiet. I also have, he continued, with the same unhurried pace, the documentation trail that connects 3 members of your financial network to accounts that were reported closed in 2019 and have continued operating under different codes since. Your former accountant documented this before he died. His daughter brought his records to Seoul to understand them. She brought them, specifically, to my house. He looked across the room at Yura, who had gone the specific color of someone whose certainty has been removed from under them. Where your network subsequently attempted to retrieve them, and failing that, attempted to have her removed through false accusation. He paused. Twice. The silence extended. Seo Yura rose from her seat. This is theater, she said. Her voice was controlled, but the control was being exerted visibly. You're performing for a woman who works in your kitchen. She works in my house, Jimin said. And everything that is mine, I protect. He walked across the room. The crowd adjusted around him the way crowds always adjusted around Sung Jimin instinctively, like a current. He stopped in front of Lila and looked at the 2 men flanking her with an expression that required no words. They stepped back. He took her hand. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was simple, quiet, deliberate, the gesture of someone performing a definition rather than a declaration. Her hand in his, fingers intertwined, in a room full of people who were recalibrating their understanding of the situation in real time. She looked at him. Her expression was steady, and there was something in her eyes that was not surprise, as if she had, on some level, understood that this was where the map had always been leading. "Anyone who has a problem with this woman," Jimin said to the room, "has a problem with me. I think we all understand what that means." He looked at Seo Mansu Yuro's father, seated at the head of the table with the hollowed expression of a man watching years of strategic arrangement dissolve in a single evening. "You have 72 hours to make arrangements," Jimin said. "After that, the documents go to 3 journalists simultaneously and to the Financial Crimes Division. I think you'll find the timeline sufficient." He walked out with Lila's hand in his, and the room behind them was very, very quiet. In the weeks that followed, the house changed. Not in ways that were immediately visible to someone walking through it for the first time. The dark wood paneling was still there, the amber light, the polished mahogany, and the crystal decanters. The garden, immaculate and silent, through the windows of every eastern room, but the energy of it was different. Madame O smiled. Once, at Lila in the corridor near the linen closet, a brief, small, deliberate smile that lasted approximately 1 second and then disappeared back behind her usual professional composure, but which Lila absorbed and kept carefully. Kang Hyun had taken to stopping in the kitchen during the early morning hours, not for any specific purpose, but in the way of someone who wanted to be in a space that felt like something. He drank tea and didn't say much, and neither did they, and it was the most companionable silence Lila had experienced in a long time. Somi had, against all reasonable expectation, kept a secret. Lila did not know how long it would hold, but she was grateful. Lila's mother's next treatment was paid for. Micah's school fees were settled for the year. Lila had not accepted either of these things easily, and the conversation about them had been the one conversation that had required the most navigation, not because Jimin handled it poorly, but because the specific texture of allowing yourself to be helped when you have spent years being only the helper was something that required her to sit with her own discomfort for a while before she could let it settle. "You're not losing anything by accepting it," he said, during that conversation. "I know that rationally," she said, "but not in practice. Not yet. I'm working on the gap." She looked at him. "I'll get there." "You will," he said, again with that certainty. The same certainty he'd had about her degree, about her plans, about everything she had told him she intended to do. She looked at him and thought about the map she'd been building since the day she arrived, all the small observations filed and catalogued and cross-referenced, and she thought about how maps changed when you understood the territory better, how the features that had looked like obstacles from a distance sometimes turned out to be the most solid ground. On a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the banquet, Jimin came to the east sitting room at the end of a long day and found Lila setting the table for a late supper. It was the same room, the same mahogany table, the same amber light, the same crystal decanters. The whiskey was there, as it always was. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her, at the warm brown of her hands against the white table linen, at the low bun, slightly less perfect than it was in working hours, at the way she moved through the space now with a comfort that was entirely different from the performed invisibility of 6 weeks ago. She looked up and saw him in the doorway and tilted her head slightly in the way she did when she was waiting for him to say what he'd come to say. He crossed the room. He reached past her to pick up the crystal decanter, poured 2 glasses of whiskey, and set one in front of her. He stood close enough that the specific gravity of him was something she felt rather than simply observed. "Do you remember the first night?" he said. "Vividly," she said. "Every horrible second of it." The corner of his mouth moved. The room went silent. "The room thought I was about to be removed from the estate in a way that might require several people to sign paperwork. The room was wrong," he said. "The room was very wrong." He looked at the whiskey in his hand, then at her. "That sound," he said. "Your laugh. In a room where nothing like that had any right to exist." He was quiet for a moment. I have spent a significant portion of my life building a world where nothing reaches me, where everything has the right distance, where I am never again in the position I was in when I was 19, and discovered that the people I trusted most had been the ones with the most capacity to destroy what I loved. He held her gaze steadily, in the way he held the things that mattered completely, without defense. And then you laughed. She was very still, and something that had been perfectly sealed, he said, moved. She looked at him, at the man who ran two worlds and had, one laugh at a time, shown her everything underneath them. At the person behind the reputation, the loneliness behind the cold, the curiosity that was still entirely intact under 13 years of careful armor. It moved, she said. It moved. He set down the whiskey. He took her hand, the same gesture as the banquet, simple, deliberate, unhurried. I did not know what to do with that. And now? He looked at their joined hands, and for the first time since she had known him, the almost smile completed itself. Not large, not performed, just real. A small, rare, genuine thing, like a light coming on in a room that had been dark for a very long time. Now, he said, I know exactly what to do with it. The amber light held them. The city moved outside the windows. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when the people inside them have finally settled into each other. And in the east sitting room of Sung Manor, in front of the same whiskey table where a crystal decanter had once slipped from the hands of a woman who was only supposed to be invisible, Sung Jimin pulled Lila Gilbert close. And for the first time in his life, the silence around him felt like something that belonged to him. Not because it was empty, because it was full.